So today's Daf Yomi is Kiddushin Daf Lamed Ches. We're going to start on Lamed Zayin on the base, 3 lines from the bottom, where the Gemara is discussing the mitzvah of those mitzvahs that are dependent upon the land of Israel. And the Gemara is discussing a dispute in the Mishnah whether or not the prohibition of Chadash, eating from the new grain before the 16th of Nisan passes, whether that applies outside of Israel. So Rabbi Eliezer says it does, and the Tanakam of our Mishnah, which the Gemara attributes to Rabbi Shmuel, says it doesn't. What's the reason why Rabbi Eliezer says it does? It says B'chol Moshe V'Seichem. It says the word Moshe V'Seichem, which means throughout the land, throughout wherever you live, you have to observe the prohibition of Chadash. Whereas Tanakam of our Mishnah says no, Moshe V'Seichem means that the mitzvah of the prohibition of Chadash only took place after they settled the land, i.e. 14 years after they first entered the land of Canaan. That's what it means. That's what it means. So the Gemara says on the bottom of 37b, it makes sense according to Rabbi Eliezer, who says that the word Moshav by Chodesh means wherever you live. So that makes sense. That's how we explain the pasuk from Yehoshua that says Vayochlu Me'avora Aretz Mimacharas Pesach. They ate from the produce of the field from the day after Pesach, that they had to wait. There is a prohibition of Chodesh, and they couldn't eat from the new grain after they entered the land of Canaan until after the second day of Pesach. Mimacharas Pesach Achol Me'karlo Achol. From the day after Pesach, then they could eat from the grain of the land of Canaan. But prior to that, they couldn't eat it. We see from here on the top of Lamed Ches Amud Aleph, Akrov Omer V'Hadar Achol, that they brought the Omer offering, and only then did they eat it. So it makes sense according to understand this pasuk according to Rabbi Eliezer. Before we go on to the other position, the Tosfos says in the Yerushalmi, they asked the question, well, why they should have been able to eat matzah the first night of Pesach anyway? They could have eaten it from the new grain, because we could say the asay of eating the matzah could override the los asay of eating the chadash. And Tosfos answers two answers. He said no, because the asay of eating matzah took place prior to Matan Torah, and the prohibition of eating chadash was given after Matan Torah. So therefore, we don't say that. And secondly, Tosfos' answer is that there was a gezerah decree that maybe even though you're allowed to eat the first bite of the matzah, the first olive size amount, the first kazai is from the new grain because of asay docholos asay, but the second bite would have been prohibited. And so there's a decree that you'll have more than one bite. And I was saying that we could add on from here and say, well, why didn't they just eat from the old grain, the matzah? So it must be that there was a mailah to eat from the new grain. And that's why they would have wanted to have eaten from the new grain. And why would we say there's a mailah to eat from the new grain? Because we know that other Gemaras tells us that as soon as the Omer was brought, they rushed into the marketplace to get the new grain. So they must have had a way of making the new grain taste better. So the Gemara, back to the Gemara in 38a, but according to the position of the Tanakama in our Mishnah, which says that Chadash means that Moshe V'Seichem by Chadash means that you can only, that the prohibition of Chadash only takes place after they settled the land, after 14 years. Why couldn't they have eaten from the new grain immediately? So the Gemara says, they didn't need to eat from it. They didn't need to eat from the new grain, because it says Ubnei Yisrael Achu Asaman. Why didn't they need to? Because they had the man in their utensils, and so therefore they didn't need food until the second day of Pesach. So the Gemara says, why do we say they didn't need? Why didn't they need food? Because they had the man to eat, as it states. Bnei Yisrael Achu Asaman Arba'im Shana. The Bnei Yisrael ate the man for 40 years at Boam El Eretz Nosheves. They ate the man until they came into the land. Al Eretz Nosheves Asaman Achu Ad Boam El K'tzei Yarden. So the first part of the pasuk says that they ate the man until they came to Eretz Nosheves, and the second part says that they ate the man until they came, and only until they could say Eretz Canaan. So which is it? Eretz Nosheves means from the Rashi says, from when they crossed the Jordan, from when they crossed over the Jordan, which is more distinguished than Eretz Sichon and Og. So that's where Moshe Rabbeinu wanted to go in. And Katzei Eretz Canaan is the plains of Moab where Moshe died. So where did they eat the man until? So as the Gemara explains, you can't say that they ate it in the land of Canaan. Because part of the pasuk says they ate it at the border of Canaan. Can't say they ate it at the border of Canaan. So what did they do? It must be B'Shiva B'Adar Mace, and on the 7th day of Adar, Moshe died. Upasak man milared, and the man stopped falling down. And then they ate the man that they had left in their utensils all the way until the second day of Pesach, and that's why it's just coincidentally that they only needed to eat the man that they only need to eat from the grain at that point, because that's where the man ran out. But the prohibition of Chadash didn't apply until 14 years later. Gemara now goes into the fact of how they had this man. Bnei Israel ate the man for 40 years. Did they really eat the man for 40 years? They ate it for 40 years minus 30 days, because the first 30 days that they left Egypt, they had man with them. So they had their food with them, so they weren't eating the man. So they only ate the man for 40 years minus 30 days. So why does it say they ate the man for 40 years? It's proof that the matzah that they took out from Egypt that tasted like man. Also, by the way, is an indication that our matzah tastes like man. So if you want to know what man tastes like, it tastes like matzah. On the 7th day of Adar, Moshe died. And Moshe was born on the 7th day. Well, the Gemara asks the question, how do we know Moshe died on the 7th day of Adar? Because it says, Moshe died. And after he died, that the children of Israel cried for Moshe on the plains of Moab for 30 days. It was after Moshe died. Moshe died. So they cried for Moshe for 30 days, and then Joshua goes throughout the camp and says, in another 3 days we're going to cross over the Jordan. And what day did they cross over? They crossed over the Jordan on the 10th day of the first month, which is the 10th day of Nisan. Say man, Shoshim v'Shloshim, deduct 33 days, Moshe must have died on the 7th day of Adar. Okay, Moshe, we know Moshe died on the 7th day of Adar, but how do we know he was born then? Well, that's the Gemara's inference, because it says, Moshe says, I am 120 years old today. Well, how old, let's say, Slavo, can no longer go out and come back. It doesn't need to say I'm 120 years old today. Why does it specify that Moshe was 120 years old today? This teaches us This teaches us that Moshe Rabbeinu was sitting and counting the years that Hashem Yisparach was counting the years of the righteous from day to day and month to month, to tell us as mispar yamecha amoei, the number of your days I shall fill. So Moshe Rabbeinu died on his was born on his birthday, but he died on his birthday, the date of his birthday, to teach us this idea as an indication of this idea that a tzaddik who lives his full life to its fullest. So therefore, he lives every second of his life. The tzaddik is maximizing his potential. What does it mean to be a tzaddik? To be a tzaddik means to maximize our potential in this world, not to accomplish the most, but to maximize the gifts, the abilities that Hashem Yisparach has given us. Tanya Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai Omer, Shalosh mitzvos nitztav Yisrael b'knisas ha'aretz. The children of Israel were given 3 mitzvos, no hagos bein ba'aretz bein b'chutz la'aretz. There were 3 mitzvahs that were given to the Jewish people that applied in Israel and outside of Israel. This is different than the big 3 mitzvahs that Jewish people were commanded to do upon entering the land, which is to appoint the king, destroy Amalek, and build a Beis Hamikdash. Those are mitzvahs that only took place in the land of Israel. But here were 3 other commandments which the Bnei Israel were told to do, but they also applied outside of Israel. And this is were referenced in our Mishnah. What were the ones that were referenced in our Mishnah? That they applied in Israel, they were tuyos ba'aretz, but they also applied outside of Israel. These are the mitzvahs of Arla, Kulayim, and Chadash. Arla is the prohibition of eating the fruit from the first 3 years. Kilayim is from the mixture of different seeds. There's a prohibition to plant a seed with another seed, or a seed with a vineyard, with a different seed, with another different seed, or a seed with a vineyard. There's actually 5 types of klayim. And the third one is the prohibition of chadash, eating from the new grain until after the Omer is brought, or the 16th day of Nisan passes. So Rabbi Shimon Chai says that there are these 3 mitzvahs that apply both Israel, in the land of Israel and outside. And it's logical, says Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, that to assume that, meaning to say achadash mefurash bo, because the one Rashi explains that the prohibition of chadash is clear from the fact that it says moshav, because Savar kol makom shatem yoshvim mashma, and Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai holds like Rabbi Eliezer, which means it applies everywhere. The arla of the klayim, and arla and klayim are also, they apply everywhere, mikal v'chomer, from a kal v'chomer. So the Gemara, the poskim are going to pass like Rabbi Eliezer that chadash is prohibited everywhere, and so we see that it could be like Rabbi Shimon Yochai's position, and is it also in agreement with Rabbi Eliezer? So back to our Gemara. What's the kal v'chomer? Just like chadash, which is explicit in the verse, she'ein isuro isur olam, which is not a prohibition forever, because meaning to say, its prohibition is only until the 16th of Nisan. On the 16th of Nisan, it becomes permitted. Ve'ein isuro isur hana. Chadash is not prohibited to have benefit, because it's only because we know in the Menachos it tells us you're allowed to cut the grain and feed it to the animals. V'yesh heter le'isuro, and also, even at the date where it's prohibited, i.e. the 16th of Nisan, that day it can become permitted on the 16th day of Nisan. Isuro nitar im yesh omer karav, if you bring the omer. So these are 3 aspects of the prohibition of chadash, and we say noeg ben ba'aretz ben b'chutz la'aretz, and it applies in Israel and outside of Israel. So for sure, kilayim she'isuran isur olam, for sure the prohibition of kilayim, where that mixture that grows is prohibited forever. V'isuran isur hana, and the prohibition is to derive benefit. This is klaya karam, which is prohibited to have benefit from it. The ain heter le'isuran, but we don't say that there's ever a heter for its isuran, that on that time when it's prohibited, it won't become permitted, and so therefore eino din she'yunhagu ba bein ba'aretz bein b'chutz la'aretz. For sure, the prohibition will apply in Israel and outside of Israel. V'hu adin la'arla b'shtayim, and arla has 2 of these qualities. What are the 2 qualities that the prohibition of arla has? Rashi says af arla ba b'kal v'chomer zeh b'shnei hachachos, that this prohibition of arla has 2 aspects. What are they? First of all, afal pisha shlishi ein ba she'ein isura isur olam. The arla doesn't have the 3rd concept, because the arla is not prohibited forever. Nevertheless, miu isur anahu, it's prohibited to have benefit. Ve'en lo heter b'toch imei isuro, and when it's prohibited, there is no time where it's permitted. But the 3rd aspect of arla it doesn't have. What's the 3rd aspect? That it doesn't remain prohibited forever. So it's like chadash. So Rashi seems to understand that the prohibition of arla, it goes away, and that's why we say ein isuro isur olam. Tosfos asked the question: no, the fruit of the arla that it always remains prohibited. The 4th year, the 5th year becomes permitted, but the fruit of the arla, that prohibition doesn't come away. So Tosfos gives 4 answers to this question, and one is that this prohibition here is referring to the concept of neta ravai, that the 4th year of the fruit, when it says arla here, refers to neta ravai, that the 4th year it can become permitted by bringing it to Yerushalayim and being poded and redeeming it. Other answer that Tosfos quotes other answers. That one is, he quotes an answer from Ramosha Mipuntaizia, that the Bezdin itself can make the day can make certain months chaser, and therefore have the day earlier. So then he quotes another answer from the Reed that it refers to a tree, and that itself does become permitted. So anyway, Tosfos gives 4 answers to this question. So now the Gemara says, Rebbe Eliezer Shimon says, Kol, we're back to the top of 38b, Kol mitzvah shenitztav Yisrael kodem knisas haaretz, any mitzvah that the children of Israel were commanded prior to entering into the land of Israel, noeges bein ba'aretz bein b'chutz la'aretz, that mitzvah that they were commanded to act with, to observe before they entered into the land, meaning to say something that's a chova sakuf, that's an obligation on the body, that applies both in Israel and outside of Israel, with the exception of, we'll see in a moment, but any mitzvah which they said, which they were commanded to take place only after they entered into the land, that only applies in Israel, with the exception of chutz me'ashmatas ksafim v'shiluach havadim, with the exception of forgiving loans, which takes place after they enter into the land of Israel, but nevertheless is going to be applicable everywhere, and the releasing of slaves during the Jubilee year. So the Gemara is going to question this assumption, but for now, that's what we say. So the Gemara immediately questions this. Hashmatas ksafim, they were commanded to observe even before they entered into the land. They were commanded to release the loans in the sabbatical year. Chovas sagufi, this was an obligation on the person. It's not connected to the land. Of course, it should be applicable everywhere. So the Gemara says, the reason why we need to be taught this is because of the following brisa, which says that indeed they were not commanded to release the loans prior to coming into the land of Israel. The Tanya Rabbi Omer v'zed dvar shmita shmot. It says in the pasuk at the end of Vayikra, at the end of Sefer Vayikra, it says in the end of Parashas Bahar, this is the law of the sabbatical year, but it's a double lesson. Zed dvar shmita shmot, which means Bishdei Shmitos Akos Medaber, the Torah is referring to two sabbaticals. Acha Shmitas Karka, Acha Shmitas Ksafim. The sabbatical year of land and the sabbatical year of money. Bisman Shatam Meshamet Karka, when you have the sabbatical year of land, the Tameshamet Ksafim, then you have the release of the loans. So therefore, Bisman She'iyat Tameshamet Karka, but when you don't yet have the sabbatical year of the land, Iyat Tameshamet Ksafim. You don't yet have the sabbatical year of the money, and so therefore the prohibition, the obligation to release the loans didn't take effect, according to Rebbe, until they entered into the land of Israel. And so therefore, according to Rebbe, we need to be taught that even though Shmitas Ksafim only takes effect when they enter into the land of Israel, nevertheless it applies everywhere. So the Gemara says, "Ve'ema," but why don't we say, "B'makom shetamashame karka tamashame ksafim, b'makom she'ena tamashame karka ena tamashame ksafim"? Why don't we say that the place where you observe sabbatical year of the land, that's where you observe the sabbatical year of money, and the place where you don't observe sabbatical year of the land, you don't observe it. So sabbatical year of money. So maybe shmitas ksafim should not apply outside of Israel. It says the verse, "Ki kara shmitah Hashem." It says you call out a sabbatical year to God, which means mikol makom, wherever you are, you release the loans. And then the Gemara says also the same question about shiluch havadim. Why do we say that? Why do we have to be taught that the release of slaves applies outside the land of Israel in the Jubilee year? Why don't we say that it applied even before they came into Israel? Chovas agufi, it's an obligation for you to release your slaves. It has nothing to do with the body. So why do we say it was connected to the land? So Gemara says no. Salkadai techamina. You might have thought the reason why we have to be taught that shiluch havadim applies outside of Israel is whole. Since it says in the Jubilee year you call out freedom in the land, which means you might have thought ba'aretz in b'chutz la'aretz. So you might have thought you call out freedom in the Jubilee land, you call out freedom ba'aretz in b'chutz la'aretz. So you might have thought that you call out freedom in the land of Israel, but not outside of Israel. So therefore, the Torah has to tell us, Yovel hi mikom makom, that it's the Jubilee year, wherever you are, you release the slaves. So why does it say you release the slaves in the land? Which it's so the Gemara answers, it's to teach us bisman shad dror noeg la'aretz noeg b'chutz la'aretz. When the sabbatical year applies in Israel, it applies outside of Israel. But if it's a time where there's no freedom in the land, there's no Jubilee year in Israel, then we don't observe it outside of Israel. And so therefore, for this reason, that's why it says ba'aretz. So now the Gemara goes back to our discussion of the prohibition of Chodesh, which again in our Mishnah, Rabbi Shmuel says doesn't apply outside of Israel, and Rabbi Eliezer says the prohibition applies even outside of Israel. So now we have an anonymous Mishnah from Arla, which is consistent with the position of Rabbi Eliezer. And many point to this and say this is the reason why we're strict. And we say Chadash is prohibited even nowadays. So it says, Tanan Hasam, it says in the Mishnah Arla, Chadash Asr min HaTorah b'kol makom. Chadash is prohibited, biblically speaking, wherever you are, even outside of Israel. Arla halacha, Arla is prohibited wherever you are, as halacha from Moshe. It's halacha, we'll see what it means. Ma'kulayim, and the kulayim, this mixture is prohibited midivri sofrim, from the rabbis. When it says that Arla is prohibited as halacha, man halacha, who is this halacha like? What does it mean, this halacha? So I'm Rabbi Yehuda Mashmuel, Hilchos Medina. It means it's the halacha of the place where you are. It means to say it's like a custom that the people of that place accepted Arla as a prohibition upon themselves, even outside of the land of Israel. Ula Amar Rabbi Yochanan halacha Moshe Misinai. Ula says the name of Rabbi Yochanan, no, it's a law from Moses at Sinai. So I'm like Ula Rabbi Yehuda. So Ula says to Rabbi Yehuda, Bishlam Oladidi. Ula says to Rabbi Yehuda, it makes sense according to me that I say it's a law from Moses at Sinai. Because I say Arla is prohibited from Moshe at Sinai, whereas Kulayim is only prohibited rabbinically outside of Israel. That's why there is going to be a Mishnah in Arla which differentiates between the prohibition of a doubt of Arla, where we're more strict than a doubt of Kulayim. Bein Suffolk Arla, Suffolk Kulayim. But according to you, how would you explain that? So what's the Mishnah? The Tanan Suffolk Arla, that Ba'aretz Asur. If you have a doubt about Arla, if it's in the land of Israel, we're going to say that the Suffolk Arla in Israel, it's prohibited because it's the law from Moses at Sinai. B'Suria is part of the land right outside Israel. Rashi says, he aram tova shekavash David, like David conquered. And then we have to change the word in Rashi. The Rashi, there's a slight girsa, and Vosifa al Eretz, Vosifa al Eretz Israel, and he added on to Israel. And the Kosever Kibush Yachad Loshmek Kibush, and we assume that this was not considered fully part of Israel, and so therefore Sveiko Mutar. Therefore, if there's a doubt about it, it's going to be permitted. And the Gemara is going to ask, well, if it's Halacha Moshe Misinai and it's outside of Israel, how can we be permitted in a case of doubt? If we're going to say that it's Halacha Moshe Misinai and it's a case of even outside of Israel, how can we lead by a suffix? And we're going to answer that this is what he's saying. Halacha, the Sveikos Mutar B'chutz La'aretz. Vada Asr, so that what's the halacha of Moshe Misinai? That if it's a special halacha and a din of a suffix, that when it is outside of Israel, it's permitted. That's a special halacha of Moshe Misinai. But if it will be a certainty outside of Israel, it will be prohibited. We'll stop here, but that's the introduction to this next sugya. And then we have this next sugya for a page, and then we have the final page and a half of the chapter. The longest chapter of the Talmud is going to be Agadata. A big shkoyach to everybody, and we'll daven this morning, God willing, at 7 a.m. Big shkoyach. Shkoyach. Okay, and